Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in today's session about AI governance, our 90-day plan from principles to practice, our framework in three 30-day phases. I'm John Halberstadt here with my collaborator and teammate, Steve Daniel. We're going to go ahead and get started right now. So a little bit about NDASH, and thank you all for joining again today. NDASH, Steve is a co-founder of the organization. A little bit about us. We are an organization that was formed about 10 years ago. And Steve, let you talk about the impetus for NDASH and starting with what the NDASH means, the NDASH character.
So NDASH, we got our name from a piece of punctuation. The NDASH is like a hyphen, but it's used in specific cases, particularly between two dates, between two points in a process. So we chose that name. I think we can move to the next. Yeah, it's because what we do is we serve as your partners in getting from point A to point B, from where we are to where we endeavor to be.
And that is the NDASH, and why we do it. And this is part of the reason that I was so happy to join the organization, but the why behind this and the formation of NDASH as an organization.
Yeah, so we recognize one of our main lines that we have here is make work feel better. You can see that towards the top of the slide. Meaningful human-centered work is the foundation of sustainable performance. So the reason why we do this, why we want to serve as the enablers to get businesses, individuals from point A to point B to their ideal state, is because we recognize that that purpose, ownership, clarity, all these things make teams more pleasant to be a part of, more efficient, and more productive.
Exactly. So it's nice to be in a place where the way that we do our work is good for our organization's outcomes, but also good for all of the people. It's nice to be able to hit both of those notes so well collectively. So thank you. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our 90-day governance strategy and the implementation overview. So this is a multi-part series. If you haven't seen the prior sessions, we would welcome you to take a look at them on our YouTube channel. But part of the impetus for generative AI governance and the focus for Steve and myself and for NDASH is as users, heavy users and guides with using AI, we are seeing more and more issues where AI is used improperly without these guardrails, without this governance. And here are some examples. We do this every time now because there's just so much in the news that reminds us about how governance is important and where it doesn't happen, where bad things happen. So these are some examples that we'll go through pretty quickly that have happened in the last 30 days or so, where we would posit that had there been better governance, good governance, governance in place, governance followed, that these issues could have been prevented or at a minimum could have been mitigated to some degree in terms of the impact. But in many cases, they could have been avoided altogether. So Steve, if you'd like to just sort of go through, we obviously could spend the entire hour just talking about these 6 examples. We don't want to spend the time there, but could you talk through high level what you found in your research just in the last 30 days, some of the fails where governance wasn't in place and what the ramifications were for those organizations that didn't have that in place, please.
Sure. So the first couple are kind of enterprise level governance issues where AWS had an outage that was caused by one of its AI coding agents that had too much permission. There was no boundary set up around it, and this caused access to the wrong servers and caused a 13-hour service disruption. Similarly, Microsoft Copilot had a bug that exposed confidential enterprise emails. And this is something to be aware of if you are using Copilot or any of these systems as a software as a service for your enterprise accounts, because these vulnerabilities exist not only at our own level, at our company level, but also at the service level. So that's just something to be aware of and familiar with and keep on your radar. So if something like this happens, you can be aware that you may need to change your credentials. Separately, We've got a couple of retail AI chatbot issues, a shopping assistant producing misleading customer guidance, another chatbot providing illegal electrical advice to customers. Those can be real issues. If you just set up a chatbot willy-nilly for your company and you don't give it strict guardrails and train it to express some level of like ignorance, if it doesn't know something, then it's going to tell your customers the wrong information and they may act on it, and then you could be liable. And then the last one here is this AI menu photos trigger customer complaints. This is happening all across the industry, not only with menu photos, but with Etsy product descriptions. This is one of those things where you could permanently lose a customer base because you rub them the wrong way with your fake generated images. So there's a lot going on in this space, but this is just a handful.
Right. And of those examples, I mean, again, even if these aren't your exact industries, you can imagine that there are likely some instances in the work that your organization does where similar things could happen, whether that is emails that are being exposed that should not be. That's a violation of many policies in terms of privacy. These ideas of using chatbots for that illegal advice or just really bad advice, how problematic that is, as Steve mentions, to your brand, your reputation may never recover in those instances. And then similarly for those photos triggering those customer complaints, if people question your credibility by using these tools and they think they're being lied to through your marketing or through other techniques, there's definitely going to be ramifications for your brand, even if your intentions were completely good. So those are just some of the things that we've seen in the last 30 days. So really quickly, what we'd like you to do, it looks like some of you already have this barcode. If you could point your device at that barcode, we'd like to just do a quick poll. Don't look, there's a couple of answers that are already in there, but what is your organization's current level of AI governance? And this is all anonymous, so you don't have to worry about it. But let's go ahead and see if we have any takers. You can also just go to slido.com and enter the code 1385871. Okay. See if we've got anybody else.
Yeah, it looks like I have the LinkedIn. It's about 5 seconds.
Delay.
So
okay. Okay. Well, we'll give it another moment. Can't tell if those numbers are changing since it aggregates. Yeah. So while we're waiting for that, we'll see if it changes. But in the interest of time, organizations' level of governance, it varies dramatically. Some of the folks that we talk to, it's the wild, wild west. It looks like we've got some new respondents in. So some we use old general IT use policies even more. So that looks like that's our top answer. Thankfully, nobody here has got the wild, wild west. That's good. That may be why you're here. But looks like by far most are using old general IT use policies or informal guidance. So that is far better than nothing. And as you will see, the first 5 of you that registered, by the way, will get a copy of Steve and my book. So 300 pages of goodness about governance, everything you'd want to know, and some things that you may not need to know right now, but you may want to know in the future. But those are some guidelines that we suggest really are starting with some of those policies that already exist. We don't want things to just be completely from scratch for AI, but we certainly want to evolve any current governance that we have to include AI. So with that, thank you everybody who responded. So our perspective, Steve and my, what's in the book, what is the N-way, so to speak, when we think about AI and governance, we think about governance as the how, those practical guardrails, policies, and review processes to manage AI risk. And that's a big part of the process and function here. But never forget in your organization the why. What are your organization's ethical principles for AI? We know a lot of the challenges with just the foundational technology that is in these large language models. There's bias on the internet. There's going to be bias in these models. So we want to make sure that we're thoughtful about that and responsible and ethical use of AI, especially for things like HR, where perpetuating bias is a real problem. And then finally, it all really hinges on these first 2 don't matter. without the Who, not in the awesome band from the late 60s and I guess into the 70s. I'm dating myself. But the Who, the leadership, we want that clear accountability, walking that talk, because those of us in leadership positions, those of you in leadership positions, are really going to need to walk that talk for people to follow these processes. So as a reminder for those who weren't able to watch the first couple of installments here, or just as a refresher, because it's been a month, phase one, which we covered last month in a little bit of detail, was the explore and align phase, where we made current use visible. We really wanted to have this visibility and get organizational alignment. We don't want to build upon a flawed foundation. So those first 30 days were really essential to build that solid foundation. Today, we're going to go a little bit deeper. I use my AI joke that nobody thinks is funny other than me. I will delve, because ChatGPT really likes the word delve rather than dive. We're digging into something. But today, we're going to dig deeper into designing and prototyping our solution and our governance framework. Again, our framework for governance is a little bit different, maybe a lot bit different than what some of you may have experience with from a governance perspective, is that we also incorporate things like from the Agile PMO or Value Management Office, the VMO. We want to also make sure that governance includes choosing the right AI things to pilot, because that's a really important point, that governance needs to make sure that we're also making the right strategic decisions with AI. And then next month, we'll building upon the foundations on phase one that were then improved upon today's phase two part. Phase three is where we actually do that pilot and evaluation. So, but today we're going to dig deep into that phase two in a little bit more detail. To do that, though, as a reminder, what did phase one accomplish? It helped us understand where generative AI is already influencing work, which tools our team members are using, and which outputs affect decisions or external communication. To Steve's point earlier about those fails, we really want to be thinking about things inside the organization, but especially where it touches customers or partners or collaborators. And Steve, I don't know if you've got any further thoughts on this. Let me bring the rest of these points up. But any thoughts on any of these items and what we accomplished in phase one?
Yeah, I think we're going to get into this in the next slide a little bit as well. But we walked away from that with a general idea of what type of big issues and smaller issues that our company is currently facing, and how we're currently using AI, as well as 1 to 2 or 3 possible contained use cases that we can then plan around for, or plan a pilot around.
Right.
So and the early guardrails as well. Yeah.
Right, and those early guardrails, as you bring up, we want to start establishing, knowing that AI is being used in every organization today. Like, I think that is just a reality. It wasn't when I started these series a couple of years ago. It is now. So we have to really change that proverbial tire while the car is in motion, as that analogy. But we do need to have some early guardrails for that use, as well as Steve mentioned. We'll go in deeper today about the appropriate use case, or a small number of use cases that we will use as part of our governance to try and pilot out AI in our organization before we start pushing it everywhere. So phase one, we had, as Steve mentioned, that defined pilot as well, where we concluded with one or a few clearly defined pilot use cases. Those use cases should be tied to real work that's performed regularly. So we want something, again, and this is different, as I mentioned, from a governance perspective than what many of you may be familiar with, which is that we want it to be based on where the use of AI solutions will help the organization improve its bottom line, whatever that looks like. So it needs to be tied to real work, and real work that's performed regularly. It needs to be something that is a big enough thing to focus on. It also needs to be relatively low risk. Again, there's a lot of gotchas that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So we really want it to be high value, low risk. Anyone who's familiar with the idea of WSGIF, you can sort of see some parallels here about how quickly can we get something good out there. Part of that is that it's small, high value, and low risk, and capable of producing that measurable operational value. It can't just be, it's going to make us more efficient. How, where, when, who, and what are those metrics? And one of the things that you'll find in our book, and we will have some references after this, where you can access some of these artifacts and these templates for your own use. But here is one of the things that we recommend is a simple one-page use case charter, which is really just a really simple way to say what's in scope, what's out of scope, what can be used, what can't be used, who can approve it, and then really looking at some of the other requirements for good governance. But again, you could do this in a very short period of time on a single pager. We want to keep our governance light. That's just an immutable principle. We want it simple enough, as I say, so that people will actually follow it. And those of us who are involved in governance and risk management know the best policies are the ones that actually get followed. It's not the longest ones, it's often the shortest ones, because in this particular instance, we want that small contained experiment, not a large implementation. And this really helps us focus our gaze and our efforts on just what that scope is so that we can experiment and have some learning before we scale. So pillar one, as we talk about, so we've got 3 30-day phases, and we've got 3, I think of them as swim lanes. So I'm a visual thinker. 30, 60, 90 are my columns. My phases, or my pillars 1, 2, and 3. The first is business alignment, as Steve had mentioned. Really in phase 1, choosing the right priority for the organization. What are we going to focus our first either singular or very small number of use cases on? So we want to make sure that there's alignment, confirm that operational problem being addressed, defining measurable success metrics. Again, it can't just be we're going to be more efficient or we'll get more customers. It needs to be specific. And to do that, and this is not just about AI and it's not just about governance, any sort of metrics, if I've talked about this probably excessively in other webinars and talks that I've given, but before you set a goal, you need to know where you are today in a quantifiable way. So baseline performance is absolutely essential so that you can actually see what the impact was of those changes. If not, then what will you compare them to? So our guiding principle really was in choosing this was we want the use case first. We don't want to lead with AI tools. And clarifying that business problem, again, it really should be, we're overstating this because it can't be overstated as much as that sounds silly. We really want good governance to be around a real problem, understanding the current process and knowing what our desired outcome should be. So we want to ask things like what task or decision is being improved, who's going to rely on that output, and also what happens if that output is wrong. As those examples that Steve went through very quickly, there was a lot of risk in some of those decisions. The ramifications of those are substantial. So we really want to not just say this is the right use case, but the risk needs to be relatively low, especially for our first attempts at this, because we're doing experiments to see which things make sense, but also to really exercise these tools properly. And we need some time to actually work with these tools to make sure we're using them properly and that they work properly before we scale.
I just want to hop in really quick.
Oh, sorry, please.
Sorry. Just to say, if anybody here hasn't attended our first, we had an overview of the entire process, the framework, and then our phase 1. I went ahead and linked the playlist on YouTube for our earlier webinars for anybody that wants to get caught up on that after this webinar. And we'll add this to that playlist as well. Thank you.
And so with that is what Steve had just mentioned. If you want to go a little bit deeper, you can go back and take a look at the deeper dive for phase 1. But this is now what's got us into phase 2. So we've completed phase 1. We're designing and prototyping. So phase 2 in the session here, we want to translate a selected AI use case into a controlled prototype. In parallel, we want to apply governance principles in practice. So we want to start actually having some guardrails there. And then we want to start preparing our organization for real world evaluation. So we want to start in parallel. That's why you can see we have 3 different pillars that we're doing in parallel. We want to make sure that the organization is ready to start having these tools used, not for shiny object syndrome purposes. We really want them to be part of people's workflow. So where phase 2 fits, if phase 1, if we distill that down into a single question, where should AI be used? Phase 2 is how should that use operate safely and effectively? And then in our next session, then it's where we actually validate our experiment, our hypothesis. We validate or invalidate it. Did it work in practice? So phase 2 is that we really want to not only identify that promising use case, but we have to define what that success looks like. So we have to start getting more specific. Progressive elaboration was a term I heard a long time ago that I've always loved, and I use progressive elaboration as we get closer. What information the system can use. So again, those guardrails are starting to be brought in a very lightweight way. This data can be used. This data can't be. Starting to set those expectations and those guidelines about what data can be used. Also, what safeguards must exist in that use. And then I can't overstate the importance of this. All those fails, again, that Steve mentioned earlier. Clearly, somebody was not doing an appropriate job. The expert in the loop. I no longer say human in the loop. It has to be an expert. It has to be somebody who can make a managerial leadership expert decision. That output being reviewed, I can't overstate the importance of that, whether that's code, whether that is a chatbot response, whatever that is, that needs to be woven into your framework. It needs to be woven into your processes. That's what good governance looks like. Anything else, Steve, as far as this and sort of the foundational reasons behind phase 2 and what we want to accomplish there?
No, I think that's great. I think making these strict or very clear and accessible and not too much work to overcome is really important, so that your team can follow these, can make this happen without having to come to you every time to ask, wait, what am I supposed to do? Like, it's important to make that clear.
Absolutely. And to your point as well, but balancing, keeping that lightweight. The best policies, and I think I quote verbatim in the book, the best policies are the ones that actually get used. And so it has to be lightweight enough that people can understand the policies, remember the policies, and follow the policies. If it's a 100-page manual, we've already lost before we started. But phase 2, this intent is that we really in phase 2 want to convert the intent established in phase 1 into a working design. So just a brief reminder again about, as we delve into, see, I did it again, the pillars of governance. These are these 3 swim lanes, really. The first is that business alignment. I see this as analogous to the product or the product owner, making sure that what we're doing, we understand the why and the for whom that we're using this from a governance perspective. Real problems, measurable business outcomes. Anything that misses this, even if you're good technically and otherwise, you're working on the wrong problems. And so we really want to connect that from a governance perspective about keeping it aligned to things that are strategically or tactically, but significant measurable terms to the organization itself. The second is what I would see as analogous to software engineering or product engineering or craft. This is really that data and tool discipline. So what tools are we using? Being knowledgeable and proficient, if not expert in those tools, making sure that we're choosing the right stack, right? We talk about that from a software engineering perspective. From an AI perspective and the tools that are available on the platforms, they're mushrooming and exponentially growing. We want to make sure that the tools that are used have transparency to them and that we can control them, that we've got auditability where appropriate. And then also establishing clear boundaries around data usage, especially if you have access to and use a lot of protected information, PII, PCI, HIPAA, GDPR, CCPA.
Or proprietary, if you're working on an application that you don't want, or client proprietary info, anything
Absolutely.
like that, you've got to be very careful. Yeah.
Exactly. So you will know that, and the book has references for specific domains, but that's something that you'll want to make sure that you understand within your organizational context. And then the last one, which I consider analogous, I have a reasonable amount of experience with quality assurance. I think of it as QA or QC, that we want to make sure that we've got the expert in the loop, and that there's also organizational change management, and that people understand throughout the organization as we start to scale this, especially about what is okay, what's not okay. These are the 3 pillars that we really see are really important in terms of rolling out this lightweight framework. So design and prototype for those pillars, the first, business alignment. And Steve, I'll bring all of these up if you'd like to talk through some of what we'll go through in phase 2, aligned to those pillars that we just talked about.
Yeah. So I'll go through in order. Pillar one, we've got our business alignment, like you mentioned, that's sort of the product manager, the product perspective. That's where we determine how can we evaluate whether this works or not. That's the success metrics. Make sure it's aligned to our goals, and that's also kind of where you determine your leadership. Make sure that your leadership team is all on the same page about all of this. Pillar two, data and tool discipline. In this, we talked about in the last when we were going over the data and tool discipline. This is where we really need to decide and make clear which tools we can use and with which pieces of data. Do we want to connect it to our Google Drive only? Do we want to connect it to our local machines? Those types of decisions, and putting limits on what tools can be used for what, and really how much AI use there really needs to be here. Because it can get really messy with all these tools out there trying new things, and then all of a sudden you have 12 different subscriptions, and that can get really expensive, or the credit usage, the token usage. And lastly is pillar three, risk, ethics, and adoption. And this is where you want to have your QA review loops. We need a process for feedback from the users, the evaluation criteria and metrics, making sure those are lightweight enough that you can extract information from them and visualize if you choose to. Yeah, all these kind of work hand in hand in tandem, and they feed into one another, but it's great to kind of split them into these parts, so then you can assign leadership to each of these individually.
Right. And thank you for calling that out again. Just to reiterate, is that this is part of what allows us to very quickly implement a framework in 90 days. Is that, to Steve's point, there are ways in even small organizations to do the proverbial divide and conquer, and that folks that are working on the business alignment and defining the success metrics can often be a different group of people than those that are starting to actually build out the prototype, and those who are establishing what the review loops are going to be. So in the Venn diagram, I'm sure some of the folks in most organizations would be in more than one, but this is something that allows you to parallelize, still can't say that word right, parallelize the efforts across these different areas so that you can get a lot done in 30 days. So defining success metrics, if we want to go deeper into that, again, good governance from my perspective, with a lot of background in PMOs, agile PMOs, VMOs, governance includes making sure we're working on the right things that have the right impact to the organization. It's not just policies about what gets to be used by whom. So often, and these are just representative, so this is not by any means an exhaustive list, but if this is something that you and your organization haven't done before or haven't done often, it can seem overwhelming to say, well, what's a success metric? How will I do that? How will I find something using AI tools? What metric do I want to get after? Well, if you say I want to be more efficient, okay, there are some immediate things that you can start measuring, and they're not super complicated. You can do them with Excel. In the olden days, we actually did some of these with stopwatches. So you don't have to measure every task if you're doing it manually, but look for things where you can get a real world representative sample of the actual time that is spent per task. How much does it take today? Baseline it, do a statistically significant sample of your team, and then do the same thing after you use this tool. But start establishing what those success metrics might be. That might be reduction in time per task. It could be just response time. So am I able to respond to a customer in 60 seconds where it used to take me 5 minutes before? Those are real metrics. Lower workload for manual tasks. So those are just some of those areas where you can really start looking for things from an efficiency perspective. Those are just 3 of the common examples that I've used in my worlds before. But there's other areas that you can look at and say, well, I want to be more efficient. If I was talking to you, I'd say, what does that mean to you? What is the actual thing that you want to be more efficient at? And then sort of talk through how you'd quantify that, baseline it, and then establish a number. So another area that's very common is quality. And that this can be from a product and software engineering perspective. But if you're not in that world, we all have things that we provide to customers, whoever they are, internal, external, and quality is really important. And AI can help in a lot of areas with that. So things like are fewer errors, less rework. So, and then improved consistency, which that one can sometimes be hard to measure, but where you can use AI and say, you know, your variability on a particular product that you produce X amount of, you want to limit that variability. AI can help in a lot of those cases. You know, if you have 5 different customer service reps and you know how they respond to the same type of call, there may be areas where AI could help with that and some uniformity where it's helpful so that you've got some consistency there from a customer experience perspective. Those are just a couple of the areas from a quality perspective that I've looked at before in prior lives that have been helpful. And then the last one of the top 3 that I normally talk about. Now, again, even these categories may not be the ones that you want. You may want one for innovation. You may want one for any other area that's important for your organization. You may want ones directly tied to revenue generation, revenue retention, risk reduction. There's all sorts of different things that organizations know that they need to care about. So start with that list. But if you don't know where to start, these are some common ones. But if you've already got things that are important strategically, I would strongly suggest trying to connect your AI use case to that and then defining these metrics. The last one from my list that's very common with a lot of my history from call centers, tech support, help desk, et cetera, is customer satisfaction. So if you know what the acronym CSAT or NPS means, then you know what I'm talking about. But those are 2 fairly standard metrics that a lot of organizations that provide service, not just technical support, but any kind of service, what are your customers saying as far as those customer satisfaction ratings? Also for satisfaction, especially if you are using this like from an HR perspective and you're rolling out some AI-enabled improvements. That was one of our examples that we gave previously about a system that would allow access, AI-enabled access to common frequently asked questions that could be solved. Your internal customer, your internal employees are your internal customers. So ENPS is just a different flavor of the Net Promoter Score. But you may also just have a culture survey or something like that. Most organizations do something like that periodically. So maybe that's the number that you want to get after. But these are 3 key areas that are very common where folks want to improve their outcomes. And so these are some ideas. If you don't know where to start, these are some to think about. The book, again, and a number of you are going to get a free copy sent to you, actually has a number of items in there too that you can start looking at of things that might be useful for your use that would be highly valuable based on your industry and your domain. So I'm happy to share those with you directly as well. If that's of interest to anyone, just reach out to us on LinkedIn.
I just want to real quick highlight that, yeah, these are success metrics. And if you set them up correctly, you may have read or heard about how a lot of businesses aren't seeing ROI on their AI investment, or they're spending more time just resolving AI code bugs or just revising AI drafted content. So these success metrics, if you set them up correctly, will also help you identify inefficiencies. If you're not seeing improvement in these scores and you're actually seeing like the scores are worsening, then you have to go back and look at why you're applying AI and how, and it can help you recognize before it becomes too late that it's not making things more efficient or optimized.
Right. And thank you for calling that out again, because one of the things that we've said, and we'll say again later in the conversation, but just to reiterate, because it's a point worth repeating, we really need to use the lean portfolio management example for those of you that are familiar with it. But even if you're not, we need to start thinking about some of these things, especially in early exploratory use, as experiments, as hypotheses that can be proven or disproven. And this will actually help if we do find, as Steve just mentioned, that the example that we chose, that's why it's an experiment. It may not have the results that we hypothesized. It's a win to learn very early on that it was not the right use of the tool. So for those of you who have not worked in domains where that's part of the way that you do initiatives, it's really important here before, we don't want a multi-year AI initiative, to Steve's point, that ultimately solves a problem that wasn't really a problem or wasn't worth solving or wasn't a good fit. So this is incredibly important. And with that, always baseline your measurements first, as mentioned earlier. We need to be able to compare, Steve's example there, it can't just be the current numbers. It needs to be the current numbers as compared to the baseline numbers before we started using AI. So this is really important. So pillar 2, as we talked about, this data and tool discipline. So in phase 2, our second pillar is that we know that there are a lot of issues that are at the data boundary. Some of the common issues, and Steve alluded to some of these in those fails, and Steve, feel free to jump in on these as well. We can tag team as we often do, but sensitive information entered into prompts, especially anything that is protected data, but also intellectual property. If there's something that's confidential, and that could be how much your pricing is or what your margins are on a product. There are things that you may not even know that are risky. That's information that you don't want getting out into the world. And, you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube, as they say. The second, and those of you who have gone through my webinars before know that this is one of 2 images that I will use anytime I have the opportunity. But I love this owl and its quizzical look. And in this case, it's quizzical because there are issues often with unclear ownership of generated outputs. And a big point that I don't know that we like to reiterate, but it's important to reiterate, is that the person using the tool is accountable for what they do with the outcomes. And then the uncontrolled use of third-party AI tools. And this is one that is just going to be a whack-a-mole game for those that are familiar with whack-a-mole and days of Chuck E. Cheese for some of us. And trying to hit that mole in the head with that little soft mallet. But as every product now has AI woven into it in ways that you can't disable, from a governance perspective, that can just be very challenging. And again, that's why we want to make sure that our governance policies and practices, including the use of data and tools, is very clear. Steve, is there anything that you would like to add to any of these items?
I just want to, I guess, chime in quick. We didn't really, because we went over this so much in phase 1, talk about the wide range of pilot implementations that different businesses might have. This might be a custom software product where the uncontrolled use of third-party AI tools is very important because the software is running it and using up tokens without individual intermediary steps. But you also may have a pilot project or pilot program in play that you want to implement. That's basically, you just want to try out ChatGPT or make a custom GPT. And so some of these things apply more to certain pilot projects versus others. And I just wanted to, call your attention to, if you do want to think about phase 1 in more detail, definitely go check out the YouTube video.
Yeah, and thanks for putting that reference in there as well. And we'll share it after the webinar as well, or just search for our motto is our handle on YouTube. So it's Make Work Feel Better. So, but there's a link there as well for our YouTube channel. Thank you, Nicholas, also known as Nick, for the owl. I appreciate that. I will use it wherever I can. There's another one of a kitten, but we don't have that one today. So you'll have to stay tuned because I will weave the kitten praying picture like this into phase 3 one way or the other. The next, as we really want to keep that prototype simple. Again, we're using prototype and experiment and hypothesis language very much by design. These are experiments, and not every organization has that familiarity with doing experiments. But the reality is, whether you call it an experiment or not, if you try using something and it doesn't work out, that's an experiment. And if it does work out, that's also an experiment. So what you do with that, being thoughtful about the fact that you treat it like an experiment, is really important. We've got a question in the chat. I'm going to respond to that in just a moment, or Steve will. But as far as keeping the prototype simple, we really want to start with a small group of users. Trust me on this one. Trust us on this one. We really want this to be contained. Otherwise, we'll have a lot of orchestration efforts, and you want to keep this really tight and focused in every sense of that word, including the number of people that are doing the work. As Steve had mentioned earlier, and Steve, if you have more color on this one, please add in as well, but we really want to limit, and in some cases limit to 0, any integrations and limit the tool sprawl to the extent possible. Again, the pilot and the experiment needs to be as small as possible. But Steve, go ahead. I don't know if there's anything else on the integration.
We've talked about this a little bit already, but two big reasons for this is costs, and those can compound and grow exponentially if you're not careful. If you have small subscriptions, it feels like, oh, it's only $5 a month, but then those things add up, especially with more users. And then the other reason is with these integrations, you have to have strict boundaries for each one about what it can access. And if you don't think about that ahead of time, all of a sudden you might have your AI prototype tool delete everything you care about from the past 2 years or whatever it is you've seen in the news. So
yeah, I saw that one. That was tragic. And then Claude apologized.
Yeah. Similarly, with minimal data sources. Yeah, it kind of goes hand in hand with this one, is limit it and isolate. That's what I've been doing with my test cases, is I will put it in an entirely like isolated space so that if my AI does go and delete everything, it's just in that isolated space, has no access. If you're using API keys, you can usually limit the create, revise, or the CRUD capabilities of your tool. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And then, and this one, I know I've already on the slide, I've mentioned this a few times, but really we want, I would say preferably one in some organizations, it may be a handful, but wherever possible, start with one and then expand as appropriate after that, or pivot after that. And I'm going to really quickly, so we've got a couple of, we got a question here from Joe Bailey. What are some key selling points for leadership to start a pilot program? Thank you for that question. We can cover in a little bit more detail. I would say at the high level, my experience, my background includes working in a senior leadership capacity at an AI company, pre-generative AI. But most of it has been in sort of CIO, CTO, and similar roles. And I will just say, it may vary in different organizations, but especially from a leadership perspective, what we want to do, if we are leaders, then this will probably already be resonant to you. But if you're working with others in your organization who can greenlight this pilot program, is really start with the point that we've been talking about, including even on this last little square, which is a high value use case. So to Steve's point, there's a lot in the news, and the data is not particularly good about companies throwing a ton of money, but also focus, so opportunity cost, into AI programs and not seeing ROI, or return on investment. We need to think of AI and governance as business people rather than technologists. And as business people, the organization exists with a mission. And so what I would say in talking to leadership is, we do a little bit of our homework and say, based on our organizational strategy, these are some things that we're trying to accomplish this year. And they could be any of those items. We want to be more efficient. We want our total transactional time from the moment that a customer drops an order to us to the moment they receive the item. We want to cut that down by 20%. Whatever your organizational goals are, start with the things that matter to the business, or if you're a nonprofit, to the mission, right? But what are the outcomes you need? And then work backwards from there, and then talk to leadership about, so here's the need, and here's an area where AI might explicitly, specifically help address that need. It can help us with efficiency by doing this. Our hypothesis is it will cut off X% of time because it'll automate these pieces in the process today, where we've got rework on quality. Providing a solid business case that shows that is not led by AI, that is a business case about solving a business problem and quantifying it. And then AI use is the how. How do we get there? But lead with the impact to the organization. I can't overstate that, even despite how many times I've said it. So I hope that helps. Joe, did that help with that question a little bit? If not, let me know, and I will follow up.
I just wanted to add to that, like you said, John, it provides insights into process improvements but also the AI literacy and expertise in your organization starting early. But the pilot itself limiting it to a pilot instead of just a broad push is a great way to generate real ROI data before scaling, and establish governance and risk controls before deploying or scaling to your entire organization.
Really good point. Yeah, thank you. Very much agree. Steve talked about this a little bit. I like to keep things, again, very simple. I like simple enough to follow processes, as I know I'm repeating myself. But I also like metaphors, if you haven't noticed so far. So when we think about data boundaries, I just see a stoplight, right? So think about 3 categories. Now, you may want to evolve this in your organization. But again, to Steve's point that he just made, I would expand that with the same principle. Keep it simple until you found a need to make it more complex. This will work for most organizations, up to fairly large ones from my experience. There may be instances where you need more categories than this, but this is what we see. And they're really simple to communicate to people because people know how to work stoplights, and we want these simple rules. So data boundaries, Steve had talked about that earlier, about what data is being used. We've talked about some issues and some of those fails that you saw earlier. The first one is a hard stop, red light. Don't run that. You'll get a ticket, and it's bad. It's expensive. So things that are prohibited. These are some examples. They may be slightly different in your org, although these ones should be fairly, I was going to say fairly immutable. I don't think those words get to go together, but confidential contracts, regulated personal information, sensitive legal or strategic documents, intellectual property. Let's just say no, and just leave it at no until further notice on those, unless you've got the right controls in place. But for most folks, if you're in this webinar, you probably don't know, or you probably don't have those. So until you do, leave things in that category, at least initially, and just the risk is not worth the reward is not worth the risk. Restricted is one where you'll probably have a lot more flexibility. There are some things where restricted, so the yield sign is under certain different conditions and some additional requirements, you may be able to use this. So it may require using a particular tool, a particular setting on a particular tool. But there are high value scenarios like financial data and doing analysis of some of that, operational data. There are some areas where this is confidential information, at least to some degree, but AI tools will actually help us in these areas. So that's one where we have to be really thoughtful about those specific uses, and that there's some level of restriction that's on top of that beyond our standard governance. And then the last one is the easy stuff. So what's allowed? Anything that's publicly available, anything that's been approved for AI use for internal documentation. So like if my company policy manual is available online, I should be able to have that information available. Like if it's available in other forms, by definition, it's available for folks. So those would be some of the things that you should just say are allowed, potentially internal policies, knowledge bases, anything that's improved for that. And just start there, and then you can talk about things that aren't on these lists as far as those bullet points in your organization, and you can decide which of those categories that they fall into.
And these data boundaries are really critical and important, but just having them in place isn't enough. Just saying that this is prohibited, but not doing anything to make sure that it stays prohibited isn't going to have any governance impact. So if you are defining these boundaries, you might need to also reorganize your files or make clear to your users, depending on what type of pilot program you have, how they should actually implement and utilize these data boundaries, how they can stick to them. And that's really critical.
Excellent. Thank you. And then we've talked about this to some degree, but just going a little bit deeper. So as I mentioned in the earlier slide, the tools can't just be good and useful tools. That is a minimum requirement. But on top of that, we really want to make sure that any tools that are available, and this is challenging these days because pretty much everybody and everybody in their extended family is releasing an AI tool. And in a lot of cases, a lot of them seem also to be vibe coded. So you don't really know what's happening. A lot of them don't have the things that most of us who have built products for decades are expecting, things like good administrative controls, any kind of audit logging and monitoring that's available. understanding what data retention policies are, although these are often buried in a, in the click through, yes, I agree with your terms and conditions and data privacy, but you're going to want to really look at that, especially if you're using it for any data that's in those yellow, the yellow part of our stoplight. Related to that, vendor transparency regarding data use. So I was not a fan, especially when ChatGPT initially came out, and there was a toggle switch that was manipulative from my perspective, from a user experience perspective, dark UX pattern that said, improve model for everyone. Well, improve model for everyone means your proprietary chats are going to go into ChatGPT. That may be improving the model for everyone, but that labeling, I think, was disingenuous. So you have to be really thoughtful about what these companies, especially on free accounts, be very careful. As once was said with social media, and I think Facebook, if the product is free, you are the product. So be thoughtful about the data that you're putting in, and especially for free accounts, what's happening with that? Why is it free? And then finally, the integration with existing systems. So we want to keep the integrations minimal to non-existent, as Steve had mentioned earlier. But if what you're doing requires some level of integration, look for things that are already in place and don't require software engineers or anything like that. Steve, anything to add on this one before we proceed?
Yeah, I think this, I just wanted to mention the integration with existing systems. Like if you have, or your pilot case is workflow automation, you will need to integrate with some of the systems, but you can limit what it can access in those existing systems. And that's the best way to do it, is very limited access and control.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. And so all of these, that final consideration, that the tool selection really needs to support that operational oversight and accountability. Again, good governance requires the ability to review things and audit things. And if that is opaque or non-existent, then it doesn't matter how good the rest of the tool's functionality is. So pillar 3, and we'll go through this fairly quickly, just given the amount of time that we've got left. Some good conversation though. Pillar 3, risk, ethics, and adoption. So we really, in phase 2, want to make sure that there's clarity and alignment throughout the organization. For those, I use the word alignment a lot. I'm not sure how often other folks use it. Alignment is different than agreement. So people don't have to agree organizationally, but there does need to be a shared understanding about that accountability. So the response that you see in almost every fail to this day is, well, I didn't know the tool could be wrong, or it's the tool, I used the tool, blaming the tool, blaming the tool. The responsibility is with the user, and that just needs to be a hard stop type sentence. Reviewing processes, as Steve had mentioned earlier, for AI outputs to ensure accuracy and quality. Again, bias is an issue there. Quality is an issue there. Accuracy is an issue there. All of those things, if there is nobody who is vetting that, and if they're not an expert, that's a problem. And then where there is a need, again, governance doesn't say that every problem will be solved by having a policy. There will be a need on occasion to escalate if there's risk, disagreement, or uncertainty. Hey, this use would be awesome. Oh, but it's using all of their social security numbers and it's got their HIPAA data. So not only am I identifying people, but their medical conditions. That's a really big deal. There's a lot of upside to it. Escalate that, have that conversation. Steve, anything to add?
Yeah, just something people don't often think about is the processes that you need to have in place in order for that escalation to work. And so that's a part of this whole preparation and pilot implementation, is making, and the alignment that you mentioned earlier, that's alignment about how are we supposed to escalate things? What are the steps that we need to take when we run into these types of issues, or to aggregate metrics or anything? Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, and just as a reminder that for all of these, including knowing when you need to escalate, the person who's using the tool really has that responsibility. And that's just a real simple, again, rule for everyone to align to. They may not love it, but it will, when people know that they're accountable for what happens with that, the right behavior is likely to occur. If I've got questions about this, I don't understand this output, I'm going to escalate, right? Because it's not the AI's fault. I can't blame the AI. So acceptable use guidance as part of this. So nobody loves these documents, but they do have a place, right? There's got to be a way that's clear and formal to some degree. Steve and I will share this as an artifact, a template that you can use to get started. But it has all of the areas that we've talked about, and you can build your own, or you can augment your existing policies if you've got a good governance policy in place. But this lightweight document, again, we're happy to share this template with you, and you're welcome to use it and modify it for your own needs. But it includes, and yours should include, approved AI activities, explicitly prohibited uses, those red lights, prohibited data, so data usage restrictions that we talked about in terms of those yellow and red lights, expectations for review before reuse. So as we are using these things, how much are we reusing them and where? And then again, those escalation procedures when uncertain. So all of the things we just talked about can and should be codified in a very simple document like this. I would say less is more. It just needs to be really clear and cover these 5 areas for everyone so that they know what the expectations are and they know how to escalate when they need to. They know what data they can and can't use. They know what tools they can and can't use. But they also know that if they have questions or concerns, they know exactly what to do about that. As part of that, our expectations, again, the expert, not the human in the loop, is that someone, right, and this should be the user, but if they need to escalate, the outputs should be reviewed for factual accuracy, compliance with organizational policies, appropriateness for the intended audience. So you can be right and wrong at the same time. And so being really thoughtful about the nature of that output and whether it is appropriate for that audience. And then alignment with internal standards, brand standards, but anything else as well. Does this match what you want to put out in the world for your brand? Escalation and uncertainty. So in these areas where users are unsure whether AI use is appropriate, just escalate immediately. No harm, no foul. It's better to ask than to guess. Where outputs appear to be inaccurate or misleading, this is very, very common. And that's why we need an expert. And if you're not an expert and you're reviewing something, you have to have it reviewed by an expert. Otherwise, the review process is not meaningful. Policies do not clearly apply. So if there's ambiguity about whether a policy does or doesn't apply, just escalate. Ask the question. It's a virtuous signal, not a negative one. And then just finally, if there's any other questions or concerns, especially as you begin to roll this out, make a good, open, safe space for people to ask questions, and nobody should ever feel dumb. The technology is changing on a daily basis. Building the prototype, this really reinforces a lot of what we've talked about so far, but it's got, as Steve had mentioned, those approved data sets and approved documents. So what can we use for inputs for this tool, regardless of what tool we're using? What can we use as our data sources? What are we going to use as our model or our platform or our technology? This is intentionally broad because you may choose a tool, you may use a chatbot, you may use a third party, whatever that looks like, just that is part of building your prototype. As Steve had mentioned a number of times, the workflow. So we really want to start from an existing workflow and looking for optimization. As Steve had talked about earlier, we want to look at our current process, look for how we could make that more efficient, more effective, improve our level of quality. That's where we want to be looking at that point. And then what is our review process? So even in our prototype, we need to have that expert in the loop process. Did I miss anything on this, Steve? I know we've only got like 3 minutes, so I'm blazing through a little bit fast.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. We can move along. Just so I can squeeze in.
So what we get in phase 2 at the end of this is clearly defined success metrics, documented data boundaries, acceptable use guidance, defined output review expectations, and a working prototype that's ready for testing as we get into phase 3. In phase 3, we're going to, after we finish phase 2, we're going to look at how the prototype is used and whether the expected benefits appear and what risks or operational issues emerge. So in phase 3, that's what we're going to be looking at. And at the end of phase 3, as we end our 90-day phase, the 90-day implementation, the last phase of that, is leadership then gets to decide to scale the solution, redefine the design, or discontinue the experiment and pivot. So we will have learning and we will have our governance in place at the end of this in phase 3. But at the end of day 60, so phase 2, what done looks like across our 3 pillars, success criteria is defined, those baseline metrics are in place, our expected business outcomes, our hypotheses are documented and agreed. Scope has been defined, including which users and workflow boundaries are going to be in place, in alignment that the prototype and experiment is to test impact. We're not prepared yet at the end of day 60. We want alignment as we start the test in the 3rd phase to everyone understands that this is to test, not to deploy broadly, although we may deploy broadly at the end. For data and tool discipline, approved data sources have been defined. They identified and documented for the prototype. The tools, we've got clear boundaries about what's allowed and what's prohibited as far as data. The tools have been evaluated for those governance controls and data handling. We've got some limited prototype architecture, and we've addressed whatever integrations, if there are any, in place, and documented expectations for prompt discipline and those controlled inputs. Our last pillar, we've got that acceptable use guidance for the first pilot use case. We've got a defined process for reviewing the expert in the loop for those outputs before we rely upon them. We've got that escalation path for uncertain or sensitive AI-assisted work. We've got documented accountability for prototype outcomes and oversight. And we've got that a set of initial governance guardrails for testing in phase 3. So our takeaways is that phase 2 transforms governance from a concept into our operational practice. We'll have those use cases, success criteria, boundaries, guardrails for governance, a prototype that's ready for real world evaluation, and then again, just getting ready to get into phase 3. So we are at time. We'll share this on our YouTube channel. I think it's actually there, and our LinkedIn as well. We're happy to talk with you if you would like to talk a little bit further. There's our QR code, but we would love to get feedback from you as well. Any other thoughts? And with that, it's 101 somewhere. Thank you all for making the time today. We hope that this has been helpful, insightful for all of you. And please connect with us on LinkedIn. Any questions, we'd love to continue the conversation. Thanks, everybody. And Steve, I'll let you have the last word, sir.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining, everybody. One thing that came to mind as we were just rushing through the last couple slides, I wanted to real quick highlight that this is a 90-day plan. So if you can't build your prototype in this 30-day, you might want to think about a simpler prototype. This is a scalable framework, but you can build it out longer than 90 days if you need to. But this is a great way to keep it isolated and compact and get results quickly. So limiting your prototype to something that you can implement in this 30-day phase is probably the right choice if you want to apply this framework.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's a really good point to end on, which is we really want something that is high value, but low risk and easy to implement. So I could not agree with Steve more. Keep looking. And again, that's one of those things. If you want to just chat with one of us, feel free to reach out. We're happy to talk through and at least give you some initial thoughts on what might be or might not be a good fit for that. But you do want something. It's a forcing function by design. So we're all familiar with time boxes from Scrum and other ways of working. It's the same idea. Figure out what you can get done in that time period. And that's a really good way. And then, based on the results on that, you can decide what to do next. So thank you all again. Thanks for making the time. Look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.